The moment Charlotte chose Daniel in front of everyone, something inside me died. I remember standing in the middle of Patrick Doyle's crowded pub, while green lights flashed across the walls and people laughed around us. Completely unaware that my life had just fallen apart, minutes earlier, I had walked in holding Charlotte's arm, smiling like the luckiest man alive. "Relax," she had said while squeezing my hand. "Tonight is going to be special." I believed her. I truly did. Patrick had greeted me from behind the bar with his usual grin. "Oliver, you're late again," he joked, while sliding a glass toward me. I laughed and replied, "Blame the traffic and the woman beside me." Charlotte smiled politely, but even then, something felt strange in her expression. Like she was hiding a thought she didn't want to say out loud. I ignored it because I trusted her completely. That trust would be the biggest mistake of my life. We walked through the noise of the pub until we reached the large table near the back, where Daniel Carter was already sitting. He stood up the moment he saw us. "Oliver," he said with that confident smile of his, "about time you showed up." I clapped his shoulder and sat down across from him. "You act like you've been waiting all night," I joked. "Maybe I have," he replied calmly, taking a slow sip from his drink. Charlotte sat beside him instead of next to me, which felt odd, but the table was crowded, so I didn't question it. Music blasted from the speakers while people around us raised their glasses. I leaned closer to Charlotte and asked quietly, "You okay?" "You've been quiet." She didn't answer right away. Daniel looked at both of us before speaking. "Actually, Oliver, there's something we should talk about tonight." I frowned slightly.
Ow.
"That sounds serious." Charlotte inhaled slowly before looking directly at me. "Oliver, I think we need to be honest with each other." I chuckled nervously. "That sounds like the beginning of bad news." Daniel leaned back in his chair like someone watching a show about to begin. "Just say it," I told Charlotte, trying to keep my voice calm. She looked at Daniel for a brief second before speaking again. That small glance made my stomach twist. "Oliver," she said softly, "I've been thinking about my future a lot lately." I nodded. "So have I. That's why tonight matters." My words seemed to hurt her, but she continued anyway. "I want something different from life." I blinked in confusion. "Different from what?" Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Different from us." The sentence didn't make sense at first. I laughed quietly and said, "Okay, you're scaring me now." She shook her head slowly. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to be honest." My eyes moved to Daniel. Why is he part of this conversation? Daniel raised his hands casually. "Because it concerns me too." My chest tightened instantly. "What does that mean?" Charlotte closed her eyes for a second before saying the words that shattered everything. "I'm with Daniel now." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You're joking," I said. She shook her head again. "I'm not." I looked at Daniel, hoping he would laugh and say this was some terrible prank, but instead he simply said, "It wasn't planned like this, Oliver." My voice dropped into a cold whisper. "How long?" Neither of them answered. "How long?" I repeated. Daniel sighed and finally said, "A few months." The noise of the pub suddenly felt distant, like someone had turned down the volume of the world around me. "A few months," I repeated slowly while staring at the table. Charlotte whispered, "I never meant to hurt you." I laughed bitterly. "You should hear how that sounds right now." Daniel placed his arm around her shoulders, a gesture that felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. "This isn't about hurting you," he said. I looked up at him and replied calmly, "Then what is it about?" He hesitated before answering. "Sometimes people realize they want something more." Charlotte avoided my eyes while he spoke. I leaned back in my chair and said quietly, "You mean something richer?" Neither of them argued with that. Around us, people continued celebrating St. Patrick's Day, raising glasses and shouting cheers while my entire world collapsed in silence. Finally, I stood up slowly and looked at both of them. "You should probably leave," I said. Charlotte looked like she wanted to say something else, but Daniel guided her toward the door. Halfway across the pub, she glanced back at me, guilt written across her face, but she quickly turned away again. Patrick Doyle walked over after they disappeared outside. He placed a glass in front of me and said gently, "Son, you look like someone just broke your heart." I stared at the empty chair across from me and replied quietly, "No. They broke something much bigger than that." The days after St. Patrick's Day felt unreal, like I was walking through someone else's life instead of my own. Every morning I woke up thinking it had been a bad dream, and every morning the memory returned the moment I opened my eyes. I kept hearing Charlotte's voice in my head. I'm with Daniel now. I sat at the kitchen table one morning staring at my untouched coffee when my sister Emily walked in. She watched me for a moment before speaking. You haven't slept, have you? She asked gently. I shrugged. Sleep feels pointless. She pulled out a chair and sat across from me. Oliver, you can't keep punishing yourself like this. I laughed quietly. I'm not punishing myself. Life already did that. Emily sighed and said softly, You loved her? That's not a crime. I rubbed my temples and replied, No, but trusting the wrong person feels like one. Later that evening, my father found me sitting on the back porch, staring into the dark garden like it might give me answers. He sat down beside me without saying anything for a while. Finally, he spoke in his usual calm voice. Your sister told me what happened. I nodded slowly. The whole city probably knows by now. He looked at me and asked, Are you angry? I thought about the question for a long moment before answering. I don't even know what I feel anymore. My father folded his hands together and said quietly, Pain has a strange way of revealing the truth about people. I glanced at him. Is that supposed to make me feel better? He shook his head. No, it's supposed to make you stronger. I leaned back in my chair and said bitterly, Right now it just makes me feel stupid. He stood up before going back inside and added one final sentence. One day you'll thank this moment for showing you who deserves a place in your life. A few days later, I realized the silence from Charlotte hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. She never called. She never sent a message. It was as if the years we had spent together had simply vanished overnight. Daniel didn't contact me either, but somehow that bothered me less. One afternoon, Emily walked into the living room holding her phone with an annoyed expression. Have you heard what people are saying? She asked. I frowned. I'm afraid to ask. She sat beside me and said, Apparently the story going around is that Charlotte left because you pushed her away. I stared at her in disbelief. You're joking. She shook her head. I wish I was, let out a slow breath and muttered, So now I'm the villain too. Emily placed a hand on my shoulder. People believe whatever version sounds dramatic. I shook my head slowly. I gave that relationship everything I had, Emily. She looked at me seriously and said, Then let the truth be enough for you. The rumors kept spreading anyway. One evening, a colleague approached me at work and asked awkwardly, Is it true you and Charlotte had a big fight before she left? I forced a tired smile and replied, something like that. Inside, every question felt like someone reopening the same wound. By the end of the week, I stopped answering calls from people who just wanted gossip. I spent most evenings walking through quiet streets trying to clear my mind. Eventually, those walks always led me back to the same place, Patrick Doyle's pub. The noise that had once felt joyful now sounded distant and dull. One night, Patrick noticed me sitting alone in the corner and walked over with a drink. You've been coming here a lot lately, he said, while placing the glass in front of me. I shrugged. It's easier than sitting at home thinking. He leaned against the table and asked, Still replaying that night in your head? I gave a small nod. Every detail. Patrick crossed his arms and studied me for a moment. Tell me something honestly, he said. If Charlotte walked through that door right now and asked you to take her back, what would you say? The question caught me off guard. I thought about it for a long time before answering. A week ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Patrick raised an eyebrow. And now? I looked down at my drink and replied quietly, Now I'm not sure who she really was. Patrick gave a slow nod and said, That uncertainty is painful, but it's also the beginning of clarity. I glanced up at him. Clarity feels overrated right now. He chuckled softly before speaking again. Listen, Oliver, sometimes losing people isn't the tragedy we think it is. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? Patrick tapped the table with his finger and said calmly, Sometimes losing people is the only way we finally find ourselves. I sat there in silence after he said that, letting the words sink in while the music of the pub hummed quietly around me. For the first time since that night, I realized something uncomfortable, but strangely hopeful at the same time. Maybe the story of my life hadn't ended in that pub on St. Patrick's Day. Maybe it had only just begun. Weeks passed before I saw Charlotte again, and when it finally happened, it felt like someone had reopened a wound that had barely begun to heal. I was leaving a cafe near my office when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Oliver. I turned slowly and saw her standing there beside Daniel, like nothing in the world had changed. Daniel gave me the same confident smile he always had. "Small world," he said casually. I stared at both of them for a moment before replying. Not small enough, apparently. Charlotte shifted uncomfortably. "Can we talk?" she asked. I crossed my arms. "We're already talking." Daniel glanced between us and said, "Maybe I should give you two a minute." I looked directly at him. "You've already taken enough from me. Stay if you want." Charlotte sighed softly. "Oliver, please don't do this." I laughed under my breath. "Do what? Acknowledge reality?" She stepped closer and lowered her voice. "I didn't come here to fight." I met her eyes and asked the question that had been haunting me for weeks. "Then why did you come?" She hesitated before answering. "Because I thought you deserved an explanation." Shook my head. "You gave me one already." She frowned. "No, I didn't." I repeated her own words slowly. "Said you were with Daniel now." Daniel cleared his throat and muttered, "We're not here to argue." I ignored him and looked back at Charlotte. "So tell me something honestly," I said quietly. "When did you stop loving me?" Charlotte's eyes flickered with guilt, but her voice remained steady. "It wasn't like that." I raised an eyebrow, then explained it. She took a breath and said the sentence that cut deeper than the betrayal itself. "Daniel offers a future you never could." For a moment I simply stared at her, letting those words sink in. "A future," I repeated slowly. Daniel nodded slightly, as if the statement made perfect sense. I let out a bitter laugh. "So that's what this was about?" Charlotte crossed her arms defensively. "It's not just about money." I tilted my head. "But money helped." She didn't answer. Daniel spoke instead. "You're taking this personally." I looked at him sharply. "You think?" Charlotte rubbed her forehead and whispered, "Oliver, I didn't mean to hurt you." I shook my head slowly. "You didn't mean to hurt me, but you chose the man standing next to you anyway." Daniel stepped forward slightly. "Let's be adults about this," I replied calmly. "Adults usually don't betray their friends." The silence between us stretched for several seconds before Charlotte finally said, "We should go." Daniel nodded, probably best. As they walked away, Charlotte glanced back briefly, but I didn't move. I stood there watching them disappear down the street, repeating her words in my head. "Daniel offers a future you never could." For days after that encounter, those words echoed in my mind like a voice I couldn't escape. One evening I was leaving my office when someone called my name from across the street. "Oliver, wait." I turned and saw Lucas Bennett walking toward me. Charlotte's older brother looked uneasy. "Mind if we talk for a minute?" he asked. I hesitated before answering, "That depends." He stopped in front of me and said quietly, "It's about Charlotte and Daniel." I sighed. That combination hasn't exactly brought good news lately. Lucas nodded slowly. I figured. We walked toward a quiet bench nearby, and he sat down first. After a moment, he said, "I owe you some honesty." I leaned against the bench and replied, "Go ahead." Lucas ran a hand through his hair before speaking. "Daniel's been around Charlotte longer than you think." I frowned. "What does that mean?" He looked at me carefully. "They started talking months before you two broke up. The information hit me like a cold wind. So while I was planning our future, she was already listening to someone else's promises." Lucas didn't deny it. "Daniel's good at that," he admitted. I crossed my arms. "At what?" Lucas answered bluntly, "Convincing people that wealth solves everything." I stared at him. "And Charlotte believed that?" Lucas gave a sad smile. "She's always been drawn to big dreams." I shook my head slowly. "Dreams are one thing. Betrayal is another." Lucas nodded. "You're not wrong." After a moment, he added, "There's something else you should know." I looked at him cautiously. "This keeps getting better." Lucas leaned forward and said quietly, "Daniel has a pattern." I frowned. "A pattern of what?" Lucas sighed. "He enters people's lives, promises them the world, and leaves when he gets bored." I studied his expression. "You're saying Charlotte isn't the first time he's done something like this?" Lucas shook his head. "Not even close." I felt a strange mixture of anger and clarity rising inside me, and she still chose him. Lucas looked down at the pavement. I tried to warn her. I stared ahead at the empty street and said quietly, apparently she preferred the illusion. Lucas glanced at me and asked, "What are you going to do now?" I thought about that question carefully before answering. For weeks I believed my heartbreak was about losing Charlotte. Lucas waited for me to continue. I met his eyes and finished my sentence slowly, but now I realize it's about something else. He tilted his head. "What's that?" I replied calmly, "Respect." Lucas nodded slightly. "You deserve that." I took a deep breath and said quietly, "So do you know what hurts the most?" He shook his head. I looked down at my hands before answering. I spent years building a life around someone who had already started walking away. Lucas didn't try to argue with that. Instead, he said one final thing before standing up. "For what it's worth, Oliver, I think one day Charlotte will realize exactly what she lost." I watched him walk away and felt something inside me change for the first time since that night at Patrick Doyle's pub. The pain was still there, but it no longer felt like the center of my world. Instead, it felt like a lesson slowly revealing the truth I had been too blind to see before. Charlotte hadn't just chosen Daniel. She had chosen the promise of a life built on greed. And for the first time since the betrayal, I realized something important. Losing her might not have been my greatest loss. It might have been the moment I finally stepped out of someone else's shadow. The morning I finally decided to stop thinking about Charlotte and Daniel felt strangely quiet, like my mind had cleared after weeks of noise. I stood in my office staring at a stack of unfinished reports when a voice behind me said, "You planning to work today, or just stare at paper all morning?" I turned and saw Grace Turner leaning against the doorframe with a cup of coffee in her hand. I sighed. "I'm working." She raised an eyebrow. "Thinking isn't working?" I gestured toward the chair. "You always this direct?" She walked in and sat down. "Only when someone is wasting their potential." I chuckled lightly. "You don't even know me that well," she shrugged. "I know enough. You're smart, you're capable, and lately you've been acting like someone stole your motivation." I rubbed the back of my neck and replied quietly, "Something like that." Grace leaned forward slightly and said, "Let me guess. Charlotte." I looked at her in surprise. "Is it that obvious?" She smiled faintly. "Office gossip travels faster than company emails." I groaned softly. "Fantastic." Grace placed her coffee on my desk and said calmly, "Listen, Oliver, people can talk all they want, but none of that changes what you do next." I crossed my arms. "And what exactly should I do next?" She slid a folder across the desk toward me. "You should lead this project." I looked down at the documents. "You're serious?" She nodded. "Very." I flipped through the pages and asked, "Why me?" Grace leaned back in her chair and answered without hesitation. "Because you're the only person here who won't panic when things get difficult." I stared at the folder for a moment before saying quietly, "You're giving me a lot of trust." She shrugged. "Earn it." Over the next few weeks, work became my entire focus. Every morning, Grace would stop by my desk and ask the same question. "What's the plan today?" And every day I answered with a little more confidence. One afternoon, we were reviewing project proposals when she said, "You look different." I glanced up. "Different how?" She tapped her pen against the desk thoughtfully. "Less angry." I smirked. "You thought I looked angry before?" She gave me a flat look.
"Oliver."
"The entire office thought you looked like you wanted to punch a wall." I laughed quietly. "That's fair." She leaned forward and said, "So what changed?" I thought about it for a moment before replying. "I realized something." She waited. I continued, "I spent too much time thinking about people who stopped thinking about me a long time ago." Grace nodded slowly. "That's a painful realization." I shrugged. "It's also freeing." She smiled slightly. "Now you're starting to sound like someone who's ready to succeed." One afternoon during a business networking event, I heard a voice behind me that instantly made my shoulders tense. "Oliver." I turned and saw Daniel Carter standing there with a confident smile. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said casually. I crossed my arms. "It's a business event." He nodded. "Right. I heard you've been doing well lately." I kept my tone calm. "Work keeps me busy." Daniel glanced around the room before saying, "You always did know how to focus when things mattered." I studied him carefully. "You didn't come here to compliment me." He chuckled softly. "Fair enough." I lowered my voice slightly. "So why are you here?" Daniel adjusted his jacket and said, "I've been expanding my business connections." I nodded slowly. "Of course you have." He tilted his head and added, "No hard feelings, I hope." I almost laughed. "You're asking me that?" He shrugged. "Life moves on." I looked directly into his eyes and replied calmly, "It does." For a brief moment, the confident expression on his face flickered. Daniel quickly recovered and said, "I'm glad to see you doing well." I gave a small nod. "You too." Later. That evening, Grace approached me near the refreshment table. "I saw you talking to Daniel Carter," she said quietly. I sighed. "You saw that?" She crossed her arms. "You looked uncomfortable." I frowned slightly. "Daniel, uncomfortable?" Grace nodded. "Very." I considered that for a moment before replying. "That's interesting." She studied my expression carefully. "Does seeing him still bother you?" I thought about the question honestly before answering, not the way it used to. Grace raised an eyebrow. That sounds like progress." I nodded slowly. "It is." She smiled and said, "Good. Because the version of you I'm seeing lately is a lot more dangerous." I blinked in surprise. "Dangerous?" She laughed softly, the confident kind. I glanced across the room where Daniel stood talking to a group of investors. Something about the way he kept checking his phone and shifting his posture looked different from the confident man I used to know. Grace followed my gaze and asked, "What are you thinking?" I answered quietly, "I think Daniel Carter is pretending everything is fine." Grace tilted her head slightly. "You think it's not?" I gave a small smile. Confidence is easy to fake when people are watching. She looked back at him for a moment before saying, "You might be right." I took a slow breath and felt something unfamiliar settling in my chest. For the first time since St. Patrick's Day, the anger that once controlled me had started to fade. In its place was something far more powerful: determination. I had spent months letting betrayal define my life. But now, I was beginning to understand something important. Charlotte's decision had forced me to face a painful truth, but it also pushed me toward a better version of myself. Grace glanced at me again and asked, "What's that smile for?" I replied quietly, "Because for the first time in a long time, I'm not thinking about the past." She nodded approvingly. "Then keep going." I looked around the room one last time before answering, "Trust me, I plan to." By the time autumn arrived, Daniel Carter's name had started appearing in conversations that sounded very different from the confident reputation he once enjoyed. One afternoon in the office lounge, Grace sat across from me, scrolling through her phone before glancing up. "Have you seen this?" she asked. I shook my head. "Seen what?" She turned the screen toward me. "Rumors about Daniel's company. Investors are asking questions." I leaned back in my chair and frowned. "Questions about what?" Grace shrugged slightly. Missing funds, delayed payments, strange business deals." I stared at the phone for a moment before replying quietly, "That doesn't sound like the Daniel I knew." Grace tilted her head. "People change." I gave a faint smile. "Apparently they do." She watched me carefully and asked, "Does hearing this bother you?" I thought about the question before answering honestly. "Not the way it used to." Grace nodded slowly. "Good, because it sounds like his problems are only starting." A few days later, I attended a small networking event for investors and business partners. The room buzzed with quiet conversations until I overheard someone mention Daniel's name again. "Victor Lawson is asking questions," a man near the bar said quietly to another guest. "Apparently some money went missing." The other man frowned. "That's serious." I stepped closer without meaning to listen, but curiosity got the better of me. "You really think Daniel would risk something like that?" the second man asked. The first man shrugged. "Victor wouldn't be asking if it was nothing." Hearing Victor Lawson's name caught my attention. Daniel had always spoken highly of him. Later that evening, Grace approached me with 2 drinks and said, "You look like you've been thinking too much." I took the glass from her. "I overheard something interesting." She raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, Daniel again?" I nodded. Apparently his partner Victor is investigating missing funds. Grace crossed her arms thoughtfully. "That explains the rumors." Stared across the room and muttered, "I wonder how Charlotte is handling all of this." I didn't have to wonder for long. A week later, I was leaving the office when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Oliver." I stopped walking instantly. When I turned around, Charlotte stood there under the streetlight. She looked different from the confident woman I had seen months earlier. "Charlotte," I said slowly. She hesitated before speaking again. "Can we talk?" I folded my arms. "About what?" She glanced down at the pavement. "About Daniel." I studied her expression carefully. "What about him?" She took a deep breath before answering. "Things aren't what they seem." I almost laughed. "They rarely are." She stepped closer and said quietly, "Oliver, please, just listen." I sighed and leaned against the nearby railing. "All right, I'm listening." Charlotte rubbed her hands together nervously before saying, "Daniel has changed." I raised an eyebrow. "Changed how?" She looked directly at me. "He's not the same person I thought he was," I replied calmly. "That sounds familiar." Charlotte winced slightly but continued. "He's always working, always chasing another deal, and when things don't go his way, he becomes different." I frowned. "Different?" She nodded. Impatient, angry, controlling. I studied her face for a moment before speaking. "You didn't notice any of that before?" She shook her head slowly. "Not at first." I let out a quiet breath. "So what happened?" Charlotte hesitated before answering. "The money became more important than everything else." I asked softly, "Including you?" She didn't answer. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument we had ever shared. Finally, Charlotte said quietly, "I didn't realize how much had changed until recently." I looked at her carefully, or until the rumors started. She looked away. "Maybe both." I crossed my arms and asked, "Why are you telling me this?" Charlotte swallowed before replying, "'Cause you deserve to know the truth." I gave a faint, tired smile. "The truth would have been useful months ago." She lowered her head. "I know." I studied her expression again and saw something I hadn't expected: regret. "Oliver," she said softly, "I made a mistake." The words hung in the air between us. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I asked a simple question. "Do you regret leaving me? Or do you regret choosing him?" Charlotte looked up quickly but couldn't answer. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I pushed myself away from the railing and said quietly, "You don't have to answer that." She looked desperate suddenly. "Oliver, I'm trying to explain." I shook my head gently. "You already did." Charlotte stepped closer. "Do you hate me?" I thought about that question carefully before answering. "No." She looked surprised. "You don't?" I gave a small shake of my head. "Hate takes too much energy," she whispered. "Then what do you feel?" I looked at her for a long moment before replying honestly. "I feel sad for the person you used to be." Charlotte's eyes filled with emotion. "I never meant for any of this to happen." I nodded slowly. Intentions don't change consequences. For a moment it looked like she might say something else, but instead she simply whispered, "I'm sorry." I studied her face and realized something important in that moment. Part of me still remembered the woman I once loved, but the rest of me understood a painful truth. Regret didn't erase the choices that had already been made. I took a step back and said quietly, "Take care of yourself, Charlotte." She watched me walk away without trying to stop me, and as I disappeared into the quiet street, I felt something strange inside my chest. Not anger, it's not revenge, just clarity. The moment everything began to collapse, for Daniel Carter started with Exactly 1 year after the night everything fell apart, I stood outside Patrick Doyle's pub again. Green lights hung across the entrance, and the same music echoed into the street. I shook my head slightly and laughed under my breath. Funny how life works, I murmured. Just as I reached for the door, a familiar voice behind me said, "You're really doing this?" I turned and saw Emily standing there with a grin. "Of course," I replied. She crossed her arms playfully. "Coming back to the exact place where your heart got destroyed sounds like a terrible idea," I smirked. "It's not the same place anymore." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh," I nodded. "Because I'm not the same person anymore." Emily studied my face for a moment before smiling warmly. "You're right about that." We stepped inside together, and Patrick Doyle immediately spotted us from behind the bar. "Oliver Hayes," he called out. "Look who finally came back." I walked over and shook his hand. "Took me a year." Patrick chuckled. "Some people never return after a night like that." I shrugged lightly. I figured it was time. Patrick placed 2 glasses on the counter and asked, "So tell me something honestly." Leaned against the bar. "That sounds dangerous," he laughed. "Did you ever think your life would end up like this after what happened?" I glanced around the crowded room before answering. "A year ago I thought my life was over." Emily nudged my shoulder. "You were dramatic." I smiled faintly. Maybe a little. Patrick handed us our drinks and said, "But look at you now. Business is booming. People respect you. And you look like a man who finally figured himself out." I lifted the glass slightly. It took some painful lessons. Emily leaned against the counter and added, "The project Oliver led turned the entire company around." Patrick raised his eyebrows. "Is that so?" I nodded modestly. "Grace deserves most of the credit." Emily laughed softly. "You always say that?" I shrugged, because it's true. Patrick gave a thoughtful nod. "Still, you seem different tonight." I looked at him curiously. "Different how?" He smiled, peaceful. A few minutes later, Grace herself walked through the door. She spotted us instantly and walked over. "I knew I'd find you here," she said. I raised my glass slightly. "St. Patrick's Day tradition." She laughed. "For someone who once avoided this place, you're very relaxed." Emily grinned. "He's showing off." I rolled my eyes. "Ignore her." Grace leaned against the bar and asked quietly, "So how does it feel?" I thought about the question before answering. "Strangely normal." She tilted her head. "Normal." I nodded slowly. "A year ago, this place held the worst memory of my life." Grace asked gently, "And now?" I looked around at the music, the laughter, the people celebrating. "Now, it just feels like another chapter of my story." Patrick tapped the counter approvingly. "That's the spirit." Emily studied me carefully and said, "You know, you never really told us something." I frowned slightly. "What's that?" She asked softly, "Do you regret anything about what happened?" I considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret trusting the wrong person." Grace nodded slightly. "That's fair," I continued, "but I don't regret the lesson." The night continued with laughter and conversation, but at one point I stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The streetlights reflected on the pavement, and distant music drifted through the door behind me. Grace followed a few seconds later. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, just thinking. She crossed her arms and leaned against the wall beside me. "About Charlotte?" I shook my head. "Not really." Grace looked surprised. "Not at all." I smiled slightly. For a long time I believed losing her was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Grace waited for me to finish. I looked back at the pub entrance and said quietly, "Now I realize something different." She asked softly, "What's that?" I took a deep breath before answering. "That night didn't destroy my life." Grace smiled faintly. "It redirected it." I nodded. "Exactly." She studied me for a moment before asking, "So what does the future look like now?" I shrugged lightly. "Uncertain," she laughed. "That doesn't sound very inspiring," I chuckled. "Maybe not, but it's honest." Grace nudged my shoulder and said, "For what it's worth, I think the man standing here tonight is a lot stronger than the one who walked into this pub last year." I smiled at that. "I think so too." Together we walked back inside, where Emily and Patrick were still talking loudly at the bar. Patrick lifted another glass when he saw me. "There he is," he said. "The man who survived St. Patrick's Day." I raised my glass and replied with a quiet smile, not just survived. Oh. I looked around the room one more time before finishing my sentence. I became someone better because of it.